Wonderful. Thanks, Dan, Nadia, and Gary for the invite to come and speak at this inaugural event tonight. It's nice to be here, and as somebody who isn't an applied sports nutritionist working with teams and athletes, it's a relief for me to have Andy and Toni alongside as well to hopefully reiterate some of the things I'll communicate to you, but also share, I guess, some of the practical and logistical challenges of the lab-based science that I'll talk about. So I am going to talk a little bit about research studies and the evidence base here today that form alternative dietary protein recommendations for those engaged in physical activity and structured exercise training. So I hope at the end of all of our busy days we've still got a little bit of capacity left for some of the things I'll throw at you, but anything that we miss, I'm more than happy to cover in questions, or if you want to email me or reach me on Twitter afterwards, please feel free to do so to carry the conversation. These are disclosures related to industry-funded work relevant to the topic of today's talk around nutrition. So this figure, again, I think it's familiar to some people in the call here, but this figure depicts the recommended dietary allowance for daily allowance for dietary protein, which is set at 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight, or that's about 56 grams of protein for somebody that weighs 70 kilograms. This value has been generated based on nitrogen balance studies, so estimating all the nitrogen that somebody consumes in their diet through protein and all the nitrogen that leaves the body primarily through urine and feces, but also smaller losses that may occur as well. This RDA value of 0.8 is set 2 standard deviations above something called an estimated average requirement, or an EAR of 0.66. And this is the RDA is considered to be a sufficient amount of daily protein to maintain whole body nitrogen balance in the vast majority of the adult population. But what we're talking about here today are alternative dietary protein recommendations for those engaged in exercise and athletes. So it's moving away from this mindset of how much protein is sufficient to avoid loss and how much more protein could we consume to optimize adaptive responses. And when we think about the athlete or those engaged in exercise, we're primarily thinking about skeletal muscle. So taking into account the well-described issues associated with nitrogen balance methodology, this RDA value of 0.8 does not consider that there may be a safe, alternative, tolerable level of dietary protein beyond that required to avoid deficiency that might actually support phenotypic advantages for certain populations, such as athletes. Those advantages could include one of the following 4 reasons. So the repair and the replacement of and remodeling of damaged muscle proteins, to allow the optimal function of metabolic pathways that use amino acids, which is particularly the case for those engaged in high levels of endurance and aerobic exercise, where there's a significant amount of amino acid oxidation, to support lean or muscle tissue maintenance and muscle tissue mass gain as well for those seeking to build muscle and strength. And a lesser consideration is perhaps also how higher dietary protein beyond the RDA might be used to support the optimal function of the immune system. I won't touch so much on point 4 today. I'll try and touch on the other 3 points in more detail. When we consume protein, we experience an increase in muscle protein synthesis. So muscle protein synthesis rates increase quite transiently. It's a response that switched on quite quickly and lasts for several hours. And then rates of protein synthesis in the muscle fall back down to fasted levels again, which is why we typically repeatedly eat protein with most main meals and snacks throughout the day. So this stimulation of muscle protein synthesis from the protein we consume in our nutrition is the primary metabolic basis through which we're able to maintain our skeletal muscle over time, when we're healthy and young. Performing demanding exercise, either endurance or resistance, stimulates a prolonged increase in muscle protein synthesis. And you can see this increase it's quite robust and it's high in those initial hours after exercise, but it's actually sustained for certainly 24 hours and probably even 48 hours, depending on the intensity, the type of exercise regime that has been completed. Now, when we superimpose, we add on feeding events on top of a post-exercise, this recovery period of where protein synthesis is increased, we get a synergistic enhancement of muscle protein synthesis. So in the post-exercise period, the muscle protein synthesis response to the protein you consume in your food is enhanced. And you can see that by the magnitude of the amplitude of these curves here. This amplified muscle anabolic response to the protein you consume in food is, again, it's thought to persist for 1, possibly even 2 days after exercise. And it's thought to be greatest in the early phase of recovery, i.e. the muscle is perhaps most sensitive to those anabolic actions of dietary protein in those first few hours after recovery. But what I'll try and lead you to today is a summary whereby I want people to think less about this really short-term anabolic window of opportunity in the recovery phase from exercise and think of it more as an open barn door. It's extended for quite a period of time afterwards. So it places less emphasis on the idea of consuming protein immediately after exercise, but actually considering the protein you consume in those early hours and with every main meal afterwards. So an important question to try and get to the bottom of is how much protein do we need to maximize muscle anabolism following exercise? If the current recommendations to avoid whole body nitrogen loss for the general population are inadequate, and there are all these important reasons why we might need more protein if we're an athletic population or engaged in structured exercise, well, how much is enough? And this is a study that we completed a number of years ago at the University of Birmingham, led by Kevin Tipton or coordinated by Kev Tipton, but really led by Dr. Oliver Whittard now at King's College. This wasn't the first dose response study to understand how much protein was required after resistance exercise, but it's perhaps the study that I know the most about and involved whey protein supplementation, which of course is incredibly common for those engaged in exercise. So in this study, we had healthy young men come to the lab, and they performed a bout of single leg exercise. And what we did was we applied a stable isotope tracer and we infused it into their veins. And we took muscle biopsies from both the leg that did the exercise and the leg that didn't do any exercise. And we were able to determine rates of muscle protein synthesis in that period of exercise recovery, several hours of recovery. Immediately after completing the exercise, participants in this study consumed one of 4 graded doses of whey protein. So 0 gram placebo, 10, 20, or 40 grams of protein. So what you can see from the figure on the left-hand side is that rates of muscle protein synthesis, which is the units you see on the y-axis here, were always greatest in the exercise leg. That's not surprising. You know, exercise increases muscle protein synthesis quite robustly. What we were able to see was that these graded doses of protein seem to continually enhance this muscle protein synthetic response to exercise. And actually the response seemed to plateau at around 20 grams, the ingestion of 20 grams of whey protein. There was a small but non-significant increase or further addition with 40 grams of whey protein, but that was deemed to be negligible in this study. So in these individuals who weighed on average around about 80 kilos, 20 grams of protein following a demanding bout of resistance exercise was enough to maximally stimulate muscle protein synthesis. And we used some indirect measures to try and determine where all the additional protein was going if it wasn't going into muscle. And we found an increase in the rate of phenylalanine oxidation. So effectively, these surplus amino acids in this study seem to be directed more towards oxidative processes. Now, this study was completed in men, and it's valid to ask the question, well, what about women? There's some very recent work from Paul Greenhalgh's lab over in the University of Nottingham that shows that in women, the maximal increases in post-exercise protein synthesis were achieved with 30 grams of protein in trained women undergoing a bout of vigorous exercise. There wasn't a 20-gram dose in that study, so it's not to say that women need more protein than men. The point I'm trying to make here is that the values, as you'll see later on from this talk, are broadly aligned. There doesn't seem to be any major significant difference between how much protein men and women need to take after exercise to maximize this muscle anabolic response. Now, of course, if you base your advice on the study I just presented and you go out into the world and tell every athlete that 20 grams of protein is sufficient to maximize their post-workout muscle anabolism and support their adaptive muscle remodeling needs, you'll obviously be met with quite a bit of criticism, especially from those individuals who have a large muscle mass and are heavier. And when I worked at the University of McMaster University in Canada alongside Dan Moore as a postdoc, he came up with an idea that might be able to try and personalize these dietary protein recommendations a little bit more. And so what Dan did was he took a retrospective analysis or a retrospective look at lots of data that had been published in previous years, and in all these studies, individuals had reported to the lab, engaged in some exercise, and consumed a dose of protein, and muscle protein synthesis had been assessed. What Dan did was take the dose of protein they consumed and express it relative to their body mass. And he applied something called a breakpoint analysis to this to effectively try and understand the point at which a plateau seemed to occur. And in healthy young individuals, that plateau seemed to occur with about 0.24 grams of protein per kilogram of body mass, which is about 20 grams of protein for somebody who weighs 80 kilos. The figure on the right-hand side shows you the scenario in older individuals, and you can see that response starts to drift, and it suggests that older people might need a little bit more protein to support muscle protein synthesis. But that's perhaps a point to discuss on a different day. So relative protein intakes to maximally stimulate muscle protein synthesis are approximately, in this study, were found to be approximately 0.24 grams per kg body mass. What you can see from this figure is, though, that if you think that each of these small circles is an individual participant from a study, you can start to understand there's a hell of a lot of variability in here. And so it's perhaps slightly reductive to say that every single person needs 0.24 grams per kg body mass, and perhaps more prudent to apply a slight buffer on top of that. So the data I've just presented to you in terms of how much protein is required to maximize muscle protein synthesis with a single serving do seem to translate quite nicely into how much protein is optimal to support your muscle remodeling needs with long-term exercise training. Rob Morton, in his time at McMaster University, did a really important systematic review and meta-analysis on this subject. And what you're looking at here are data from a number of different studies in which resistance exercise training was performed with additional protein or a normal protein diet. This figure here shows you the mean effect size change in lean or fat-free mass as a readout of how much muscle people were developing over the course of the training intervention in all of these studies. So you can see that if the small dot for each of these studies falls on the right-hand side of this vertical line down the middle here, it suggests there's a favorable effect of protein for gains in muscle mass with resistance training. And you can see that for nearly all of the studies that used in this analysis, there is a small but significant favorable effect, showing that additional protein seems to support greater gains in muscle mass with an extended period of exercise training. The authors of this study were also able to apply again this concept of a breakpoint analysis to start to understand where a plateau might occur. And again, lots of variability here in where that plateau occurs. But in terms of the change in fat-free mass as a readout for muscle hypertrophy with training, the authors nailed down this value of 1.6 grams per kilogram body mass of protein per day, which is 2 times the current RDA that I presented to you on the opening slide. But this value makes sense when you consider the per meal recommendation I just gave you. Add a little buffer on top of that to make sure you really maximize the response. And if you multiply that across several feeding events, meals, and snacks in a given day, you start to come out at a value of around about 1.6 grams. So we've got quite convincing evidence from across a number of different study lines here. Again, using a relatively novel, a relatively new technique to understand how much protein is required to optimize whole body protein needs in athletic populations. Data from Dan Moore's lab at the University of Toronto has shown that using, again, breakpoint analysis and the indicator amino acid oxidation technique, that a plateau in phenylalanine excretion, which effectively tells us where the point at which whole body protein synthesis needs might start to be met, seems to occur at around about 2 grams per kg body mass a day, which is around about 2.5-fold higher than those current recommendations. So again, a different experimental approach here, but feeding into this similar narrative that the protein requirements of those engaged in regular structured exercise training seem to be substantially higher than the current RDA. It's worth highlighting that the example in this slide here was from resistance exercise trained individuals. but actually it's quite similar for endurance trained individuals as well, which again might go against common perceptions. We think about those engaged in resistance training as being bigger with higher muscle mass, and therefore protein nutrition is a higher priority. But actually there are, there is very clear rationale, as I tried to highlight in the opening slides, for actually using dietary protein to replace, repair, replenish, and ensure the optimal functioning and metabolic pathways, even in those individuals engaged in endurance exercise training. So again, similar, different study, similar technique used, this indicator amino acid oxidation technique, to start to understand how much and what level of dietary protein do whole body needs start to become optimal or met. And in these endurance trained individuals, so this is over 24 hours after a demanding bout of endurance training, you can see these values again were very high. It's worth pointing out from the past two slides that the data generated from this technique refer to whole body requirements. They don't really drill down on muscle specific requirements, but nonetheless, it feeds in again to this really clear story that's coming through in the experimental evidence that dietary protein recommendations are way beyond current RDA for the general population. I wanted to highlight, before I moved topics, some really important work from Tyler Churchward-Vinay when he was at Maastricht University with Luc van Loon, that again fuel this idea that dietary protein is a really key component, or higher dietary protein is a key component for the endurance athlete as well. In this study, these well-trained cyclists underwent a demanding bout of cycling exercise, and rates of muscle protein synthesis, which are the figure on the left-hand side and the figure in the center, were determined in response to graded doses of protein. So 0 grams, 15, 30, or 45 grams of protein. And there's a lot going on here in this slide, but the take-home point is that the consumption of 30 grams of protein after a demanding bout of endurance exercise in these well-trained cyclists was sufficient to maximize or saturate rates of muscle protein synthesis in these individuals. So irrespective of the exercise modality, higher dietary protein, the evidence for higher dietary protein is really, really clear. I mean, I don't need to say too much, but what I wanted to try and do here in this slide was put this into context a little bit. So what I've done in the column on the left-hand side is outline a number of different body mass. Body mass is those individuals who are at the lighter end and those who are heavier end. And what I've tried to do is show you roughly how much protein, 0.3 grams per kg per meal, what that looks like. And then if we multiply that up over several feeding events, meals, snacks in a day, what that looks like if you're trying to hit 1.4 grams per kilogram body mass a day, which I would suggest is the lower end of recommendations for those engaged in structured exercise training with a defined physiological or phenotypic or performance outcome. And then also on the right-hand side, how much dietary protein that looks like if you take what I consider to be the higher end of those safe recommendations for those engaged in exercise. Again, I think Dan will share the content of this talk afterwards, and I'm happy to share these slides with everyone as well. So I wanted to focus on a few slides before I close on the conversation around how important is the source of protein that you ingest in terms of muscle anabolism and muscle adaptive remodeling with exercise training. It's an incredibly topical question that comes up time and time again. People want to know what type of protein they should eat, where they should go to get their protein, different types of supplements, animals, plants, whole foods, powders. And to really get to the heart of this question, we need, first of all, to ask, are all proteins created equal? This figure here shows you the protein quality scores of a range of different protein sources. So these are data that show the digestible indispensable amino acid score, or the DIAS. So the DIAS is determined by the most limiting indispensable amino acid in the protein in relation to its corresponding content in a theoretical reference protein that provides all your amino acid needs. So the best way I can try and frame that is if we use casein as an example. So based on the most limiting or the indispensable amino acid, or the indispensable amino acid that's lowest content in casein, if we consumed casein at the current RDA, so we consume 0.8 grams per kilogram of our body mass of casein in a given day, it would still provide us with 140% of the daily requirement of the most limiting of those essential amino acids. So it tells us here that casein has a really high protein quality score. It gives us everything we need in abundance in terms of those key amino acids that our bodies can't make themselves and we can only get through food sources. And what you can see if you track down this figure here is that about midway there seems to be a split. There's a stepwise decline in the protein quality scores. And really that refers to primarily to differences in protein quality between typically animal-based and plant-based proteins. So most scoring metrics will spit out data that suggests that the higher essential amino acid content and potentially the greatest rates of digestibility in animal proteins gives them a superior score. So it means that more of these important essential amino acids might become available for use in tissues like muscle when we consume our protein through animal sources, but it's not necessarily as straightforward as that. But without doubt, there's no difference that given these divergent protein quality scores, the prevailing opinion is that not all protein sources are created equal in terms of how they can support muscle anabolism, especially around exercise. And certainly you can see from this figure here, a wonderful figure put together by Stefan Pincus, that Philippe Pincus, it's more challenging to acquire 20 grams of protein when you try and get that from most conventional plant-based sources as compared to animal-based sources. So those protein sources highlighted in green show that it's relatively easy to get 20 grams of protein without compromised, very high levels of energy intake. Whereas if you were to try and get that 20 grams of protein from potatoes, you'd be eating potatoes for quite a few hours. And this is really based on the idea that thinking beyond the total protein content, more towards specific amino acids in our protein that might be very important for supporting muscle anabolism. And generally the leucine and the essential amino acid content of a protein source is thought to be really important in driving postprandial fed state muscle anabolism. So leucine in particular is thought to be important as both a signal and a substrate for muscle protein synthesis. And the figure on the right illustrates the essential amino acid and leucine concentrations of different protein sources. So it's an extension of the figure I showed on the previous slide of overall protein quality scores. What we're doing here is drilling down on the specific essential amino acid and leucine content. And it's a similar story. For the most part, you can see that these animal sources of protein on the right-hand side, shaded in light gray, seem to contain more essential amino acids and leucine than most conventional plant-based sources. So all of this feeds into, again, a narrative that would suggest that consuming a higher proportion of animal protein in your diet might be more effective for supporting muscle anabolism or your muscle remodeling goals with training. And again, we produced a systematic review and a meta-analysis a number of years ago, led by Dr. Paul Morgan, now at Manchester Metropolitan University, that again seemed to fuel this narrative. So in this meta-analysis, we were interested to understand how the quality of an ingested protein source influenced muscle protein synthesis. So all of the studies we used in this meta-analysis compared two different protein sources after exercise and measured muscle protein synthesis. And what we were able to show is that across the studies, whether they were in young or old, there seemed to be a favorable effect in terms of how the higher quality protein sources seem to elicit from animal sources seem to elicit greater rates of muscle protein synthesis. We think the explanation here is mainly around the way these experimental studies that assess muscle protein synthesis have been designed. It might feed into showing favorable effects of animal sources of protein. But just to close up with a couple of slides to try and change some perceptions and some thinking around this, a more contemporary view is that it is possible to make plant-based proteins and a vegan diet more effective for supporting muscle anabolism, not just in older adults, as it says there, but in the general population. So everything I've said to you so far on protein quality gives you the sense that it's all geared towards animal over plant protein intake to support those muscle protein synthesis needs. But this figure from a recent review from the lab of Stuart Phillips highlights three fundamental issues that present with plant protein ingestion and actually some potential solutions to overcome these issues. And I've pulled out a few in the bullet points on the side here where there is emerging evidence, and they include using blends of plant proteins or complementary plant-based foods to provide a full complement essential amino acids and a high amount of leucine to support muscle anabolism. To increase the dose, just consuming more plant-based protein to match the muscle anabolic properties of animal proteins. Strategies to try and enhance the bioavailability, how much or the proportion of the amino acids in plant proteins that becomes available for use in muscle, and also potentially some extraction and fortification strategies. So taking a lower quality plant-based protein that may be deficient and adding some of these key essential amino acids back to it in order to make it more efficacious for muscle. And I want to also touch on the point around supplements versus whole foods. So a lot of the experimental evidence has been generated so far, and certainly all of the studies from our meta-analysis really have been focused on isolated forms of animal or plant protein given in supplemental drink form. And I want you all to really, don't discount the food matrix effects of plant and animal sources for muscle anabolism and adaptive remodeling. What I mean by food matrix effect is that thinking beyond an isolated protein powder and a supplement, we're starting to discover that there are things in our food, in the whole food matrix, not just amino acids, but other vital micronutrients that may seem to play an additive role and support muscle protein synthesis. Now, all of this work is in its relative infancy, but there's something to be said for trying to get protein from whole food sources as opposed to supplemental sources. And I want to just leave you with that thought. And really, we need to start thinking beyond bioavailability of proteins, how quickly amino acids or leucine appear in our blood. It's probably a little bit more important than that. The final slide from me before I summarize is to highlight some data from Ben Wall's group down at the University of Exeter. And what I want to try and do here is bring together this the concept that if dietary protein intake is sufficiently high and exercise training is present, my belief, and I think the mounting evidence supports this, is that the source or the quality of the protein you consume seems to have little bearing on muscle protein synthesis and by extension, the adaptive response of muscle to exercise training. So it's a really cool study from a series of projects that have been done down in Exeter, in which the authors conducted a study in which young healthy adults consumed a very high protein diet, 1.8 grams per kilogram body mass of protein a day, either from as part of an omnivorous diet, so a mix of animal and plant foods, or largely from an almost exclusively vegan diet. And what you can see from the vegan diet was composed largely of mycoprotein, which is a fungal derived protein source used commonly in corn products. And I'm not receiving any funding from corn, so there's nothing there for the shout out. The participants consumed these diets over a 10-week period of whole body resistance exercise training, and muscle protein synthesis was measured at the start of the study over the first few days of training, and muscle mass and strength change was measured over the next 10 weeks. And the point to take home here is around all these data is that rates of muscle protein synthesis did not differ between the diets, and how much muscle mass and strength these individuals gained over the course of training did not differ. So that leads me to my conclusions. Take home points tonight. Exercise training increases the responsiveness of muscle to the anabolic actions of amino acids from dietary protein. It's very difficult to just introduce more protein without exercise around and expect that will influence your muscle adaptive goals. In a conventional eating pattern, so what I mean by that is 4 to 5 meals or snacks over the course of a day, my guidance is that consuming somewhere between 0.3 to 0.4 grams per kilogram of your body mass with each of those feeding events is probably sufficient to maximize muscle protein synthesis and overall daily muscle anabolism. In unconventional eating, and ultimately, if you piece all this together, you multiply these per meal requirements up, it leads you to somewhere around about 1.6 grams per kilogram of protein a day to maximize those muscle anabolism and support longer term remodeling. My opinion is that the distribution of protein, how you space it across the day, is becoming increasingly less important. It was previously thought that equal distribution of protein across meals and snacks was a really key consideration. More contemporary evidence suggests that's not the case. And I make this point here based on some very new evidence that emerged just before Christmas from Jorn Trommel, and that showed that consuming very large protein doses over just 1 or 2 meals in a given day might also be sufficient to maximize muscle protein synthesis stimulation and your daily muscle anabolism needs. Now, I can't think of many scenarios where that might be possible, but if we think about Muslim athletes celebrating Ramadan and consuming fewer meals in a day, then there's potentially a practical application there. But how you get this protein in it seems to be of less importance. But again, if we think about social norms, certainly for athletes, this idea of repeated eating throughout the day, frequent meals and snacks, it makes sense that we that in each of those we aim for 0.3 to 0.4 grams per kg mass. And the final point to make is that if your athletes, those engaged in exercise, can hit these higher levels of total dietary protein intake that extend well beyond the current RDA, my opinion is that optimal muscle adaptive remodeling is absolutely possible on a well-planned plant-based diet. Okay, I'll close there. Thanks, Dan, and sorry for running over slightly. I'm happy to wait for questions if it's better to get another speaker.
I think they are the notes, actually, Andy. We can see
you can see everything.
View. Yeah, it's a presenter view.
Yeah, it's okay now. We could see the notes initially, Andy, but it's looking okay now. Thanks, Neil. Yeah, thanks for the introduction. A quick little bit of background about who I am. Really lucky to spend 4 years at Sterling with lots of brilliant people, especially in the nutrition world. Nadia, who we've got on tonight, and Kevin Tipton, Ollie Whittard, all these people who are experts in the nutrition world. That really pushed us on to go on to want to do more around nutrition. I also got to work with the football team down there, which compete in the Lone League. When I went down to Loughborough, again, great nutrition team there, and also a lot of elite level athletes. So I got to work with Team GB for wheelchair rugby, which I'll talk a little bit more about. After I'd finished my time at Loughborough, moved on back home up to Highland, where I've been lucky enough to work with all sorts of different athletes through Highland Rugby and some other nutrition events. A little bit of a unique approach that I thought I could bring tonight was through the public health role that I have as my kind of day job. So previously worked for the council, now with NHS Highland, and I work to Health Priority 4, which is to reduce the harm from alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs. And there's a lot of learning from these whole population approaches and early intervention approaches, and how we sort of talk about nutrition as well. So one that's quite popular is Planet Youth, or the Icelandic prevention module. So we're changing the environment around young people to reduce the number of substances they're using. So can we change that nutrition environment around athletes? And there's lots of great examples of that working really well. I suppose my public health roles also made us think about unintended consequences of our interventions. If we're really pushing for high protein, does that impact our other dietary intakes as well? And also there's a point around accessibility, so how we share resources with our athletes. Is it in a format that they can understand? And inequalities as well. We're facing a cost of living crisis, and do we consider that with our nutrition recommendations? Are they affordable? All these sort of things that perhaps is a slightly different lens, but I think is super relevant to sports nutrition practice. So a little bit on the time I spent with GB Wheelchair Rugby. These guys are a mixture of non-spinal cord injured athletes and spinal cord injured athletes, and both have difficulties with overheating. The spinal cord guys, they can't sweat below the level of injury, so we really needed to find a practical way to keep these guys cool and make sure that they can perform to the best of their ability without overheating. So we looked at whether ice slurries would be effective for reducing that thermal stress, and we essentially just got them into a really hot environment, let them warm up there for about an hour, and then got them out doing some of their it was an exercise program that matches the intensity of competing, and we got quite close, some really good individual responses around the effectiveness of ice slurries, but it was quite a small sample size, and we didn't quite get enough to show the effectiveness of them. But it was also a really good experience working at the highest level of elite sport, and a fantastic sport. If anyone is watching the Paralympics, I'd highly recommend a bit of wheelchair rugby. So we didn't quite find it, but thankfully, after further research and a larger sample size in wheelchair tennis, they managed to find that ice slurries did help with that thermal strain, and it was used to success when they finally got to compete in Tokyo 2020, which happened in 2021. So moving on to what we've done in Highlands since I've moved back up the road. The club's been brilliant in terms of taking on the advice, and we've worked hard on both an individual level and a team level to benefit the athletes there. They are amateur athletes, so that's always considered. They always have different goals, age, size, lifestyle, what that individual's wanting to do. All that's sort of taken into account when we're building plans for these guys. And we ultimately try to take a food first approach, but we also do support that with some supplement use, but just in a very limited evidence-based way. Worked well with both the academy and the sort of senior level guys, and the overall aim of what we've tried to do with Highland Rugby Club is empower players to make their own choices. They're the ones who ultimately make that decision when they're shopping for their food, and make some lasting impact. And just to highlight that rugby's for everyone, this is my favourite photo from my time at Highland Rugby, is a 150, 60 kilo prop just running past someone and sending them the wrong way. So a great photo as well. An example of the team-wide interventions was we set out to deliver a perfect weekend of sports nutrition, and the players really bought into this idea that they only need to get it spot on for 3 days of the week, and we tailored the plans loosely based off their size and whether they were a back or a forward. And they're provided with a plan for match day -1, match day, and match day +1. The real focus was on having high protein, and it was set to be realistic for all players. And some of the lasting impact has been how we prepare for match day. Players really bought into this idea of having jam and bagels as a meal that doesn't sit too heavy in their stomach, and they still feel like they have the energy for the high intensity sport, but they're also it's something that they're comfortable doing as well. So really good feedback, and that's had a bit of a lasting impact as well. We've also got an example from an individual approach. I'm working with a young lad who's he's under 18s, and he was needing to move from his position into the front row, which means he had to gain a significant amount of weight and muscle mass. And you know, like Leigh talked about there, we're up at the recommendation of 2.2 2 grams of protein per kilogram of body mass. So that's kind of the upper range of what Leigh was talking about there. And that really could be quite a challenging target to aim for, but as they start to aim for this target, then they're moving in the right direction and they're increasing their protein intake. 30% of the energy intake came from fat. It's just as a general health recommendation. And as they're working hard, training hard, lots of additional training sessions as well, we spent the rest of that energy on carbohydrate. Again, we considered his size, his age, the fact that he was still in school and sitting exams, any allergies, food preferences, lifestyle, the fact that he was driving down the road a couple of times a week, training and competition demands, all these things were considered. And then he was provided with a meal plan, an example of what he could do, not just this is what you have to eat, just some guidance around it, targets to aim for, and lots of recipes to give him some ideas. I suppose every day is a school day, based on what Leigh's just said there, but we did advise that he spread protein throughout the day. We noticed that around breakfast and lunchtime, it was a lower protein intake. And I suppose that's a practical way to increase protein intake, regardless of whether that distribution is important or not. It's just easier to spread it out throughout the day, and it drives that feeling of fullness protein as well. So on a kind of personal level, is it easier to spread it throughout the day? We took generally a more slower approach, especially because of his age, but also it's more sustainable, and we've got, if he does plateau, we've got room to increase the calories and push on from there. But what we did, and the graph on the right hand side shows, is we took skin fold measurements. So we can see in black there that his weight is increased by about 5.5 kilograms. We've also got his fat free mass, which is always his muscle and bones and connective tissue is all your fat free mass. But the only part of that that's going to change really is muscle. So we can pretty confidently say he's gained around 3 kilograms of muscle, which is brilliant, and his percentage body fat did increase, but that was kind of expected given where he was starting and given the fact that he's moving position, and there was room to do that. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the strengths and challenges in working in Highlands, and I'm sure a lot of the Highland folk on the call will hopefully agree with me here, but a lot of the teams I've had the pleasure of working with have that real community or family feel to them. They really look out for one another, very welcoming, which is really helpful. It gives you that freedom to implement interventions that you know work, and a benefit of that can sometimes be a limited number of stakeholders in Highland clubs that give you a bit more freedom. You don't get tied up in lots of different stakeholders wanting different things from you. And these people who have that willingness to learn and improve and change, I've always felt valued, and that they want that value and expertise in what they're doing. I'll get onto it a bit more, but travel is obviously a huge challenge, and the amount of money that clubs spend on travel can mean that it's harder to prioritize some of this stuff or spend money on. Sports nutrition, it doesn't come as such a big priority, which is totally understandable. The last one around population is just around where it is a smaller and more rural community at times, Highland, especially outside of Inverness. So you're pulling upon working with a smaller group of athletes, particularly those up at the higher end of that sort of elite athlete level. And there is a smaller group of practitioners, a smaller level of resource. So it's making that work in Highland. It can be a challenge, but ultimately I think one that we can rise to quite well as well. And I did say I wanted to talk about travel. So just to sort of introduce this, we've got our home and away wins for Highland Rugby this year, and it was overall a good season for our first team. A really good record at home, getting 7 wins there. But you can see almost all of our losses come from playing away. And we look at who we were chasing this year, and who I went to win the league was Ayr, and they had a perfect record at home and did very well on the road as well. So it's how do we challenge that? Similar thing for Ross County here. You've got home and away league table, significantly higher up the home table than the away table, and everyone knows it's harder to play away from home. There's all sorts of reasons why, but I believe nutrition is a factor and what we can do on the road. These tables are a bit harsh on Dundee because they did finish in the top 6 as well, and St Mirren in there as well. Just a couple of maps to illustrate the point. Again, if you're from Highland, I probably don't need to tell you this, but from Dingwall down to Kilmarnock, it's almost 4 hours. Dingwall across to Aberdeen, 2 hours 40. That's probably one of your shorter trips. For the Highland guys, if you're going down to play a Borders team such as Melrose, that's 4 hours in the car. Usually folk are on the bus, and and that's a non-stop time as well. So it's a real significant time commitment, and how you feel when you get off the bus will impact how you compete. So we did have a look at this and how we can address this through nutrition. One of the challenges identified with Highland Rugby was that we really couldn't have any capacity to keep food nice and cold. So anything you prepared beforehand, that wasn't really an option. So what are the food options coming up day 9? No one really wants to stop for too long. We need it to be high in both carbs and protein. And we need something enjoyable that's going to sit well after high intensity exercise. So this quick Tesco deal here, with pasta pot, milkshake, protein bar, we got up to 52 grams of protein, which is great, alongside a post-match recovery drink as well. So making the best on the road. So what's next? Good question. There is a new season coming up with Highland, so really excited for that. For myself, looking back, we've had problems with injuries, we've had problems with recovery. The lads really get the performance side of things now. Can we shift the focus towards recovery? We've got new players coming in who need to be brought up to speed. There's improvements we can always make in around pre-season, in terms of where lads are at with their body composition, and can we make some of those changes that I talked about earlier around the environment that makes these behaviours more likely. And yeah, elsewhere in Highland, I'm always open to opportunities. I will pop my email in the chat, and yeah, hopefully that was helpful.
Thank you very much, Andy. Thank you very much for this very insightful session and for all what you shared with us. Thank you. So we'll leave your the questions for the end of the 3 lectures. So now, thank you, Andy. And now I'll introduce Toni Lamb. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Toni. Toni has a very impressive academic background. She earned a first-class honors degree in sports and exercise science from the University of Stirling, and she also got a sports nutrition master's degree with distinction from Liverpool John Muir's University. Toni is the lead performance nutritionist for the male pathway at the Scottish Rugby. The role sees Toni leading the nutritional support across the male pathway from the under-16s to the national team. Toni's belief is that nutrition is paramount in athletes' health, development, and performance. She plays a key role in the curriculum used to develop the next generation of international players, working alongside with other departments in the multidisciplinary team. as the core to Toni's approach is creating a positive relationship with food and fueling. And before working at the Scottish Rugby, Toni worked at her Heart of Midlothian Football Club, where she was a performance nutritionist of men's first team when they were promoted from the Scottish Championship back into the Scottish Premiership. She also contributed to the success for athlete development within the women's first team, the men's B team, and the under 18s. Today, Toni will talk about how she uses protein in her practice, and she will be discussing how to structure protein intake throughout the day and how to adjust nutrition to the training environment and how to use supplements. So thank you very much, Toni. And yeah, if you can start your presentation, please.
Perfect. Can everybody see and hear me? I think it might still be pinned on Andy.
I'll pin you now. Unmute you.
Perfect. Fabulous. So thank you very much to Leigh and Andy so far for two fantastic presentations. My presentation will mainly just focus on how I apply some of the science to the strategies that we use at Scottish Rugby. So a little bit of the overview of today. We'll cover key meal opportunities throughout the day to optimise fueling and recovery, touch on protein content of meals and snacks, protein content of food, but also a couple of things not to forget. So this diagram will look a little bit familiar from Leigh's presentation, but the principle is ideally you want more periods of muscle protein synthesis in order to promote muscle hypertrophy, which essentially is building lean muscle mass. And as we know from Leigh's presentation, every time you eat protein, it stimulates that muscle building process, but also if you pair that with resistance exercise, it adds an additional boost to that muscle protein synthesis. So the athletes that I deal with are predominantly male, but this is also applicable to female athletes as well. But essentially, we want to have more periods of that muscle protein synthesis rather than that muscle protein breakdown. And if over a longer period of time through hard work, care to your nutrition, training really hard, ultimately, you will see increases in lean muscle mass. So when we look at the key meal opportunities throughout the day, the key ones that I promote to our athletes are: on school and training days, we look to have 3 main meals and 2 to 3 snacks and another couple of additional carb boosting snacks, which we'll not touch on today. But essentially, I try to promote meal opportunities throughout the day because that gives the key opportunities for fueling that our players should be sticking to prior to coming to training. I should also mention that this is mainly within our academies in our regional training centres and not really that applicable to our international athletes that I'll touch on later when they come into camp with us. We then look at non-training days because these are equally as important to optimise that recovery before they ultimately come back into train with us, because they will train on a Monday and a Wednesday with us, and then they will have a Tuesday and a Thursday off, and they will also have a gym session on a Friday as well. So it's really important that they take care of their nutrition on and off days as well to make sure that they are optimally recovering. But ideally, we want to look at breakfast, a snack, lunch, snack, dinner, a snack, with a couple of those fueling snacks in on training days as well. So how do you factor this into your schedule? A couple of people on the call might be parents, but they might also be athletes. So biggest thing that I drill home, hammer home in all my presentations is plan. If you don't plan your nutrition, you're not going to be able to execute it optimally. So it's really important that you take care around your own nutrition, have a look at key eating opportunities throughout your day, whether it's college, school, university, or if you're in a full-time training environment as well. So really important that you plan your nutrition around whatever you have on. Meal prep, the cost of living crisis is massive just now, so it's really important that we prep our meals in advance to make sure that we're cost saving where we can. And ultimately, if you do need to pop to the shops on the way to training or way home from training, you can do so. But if you prep the majority of your stuff at home, you will have the cost saving that will allow you to pop to the shops to pop any additional snacks or meals that you need in. The biggest thing that I have with some of my players is that they forget Technology is brilliant nowadays. You can set reminders on your calendar apps, you can set alarms to pop up. So if you do feel like you are somebody that does forget, set reminders to remind you about your mid-morning snack. If you're at school, maybe you just need to put it right next to your pocket where you will put your books back in that will remind you as well. When we talk about our main meals, again, I don't particularly like giving meal plans out. We want to try and promote the really good performance behaviours and performance habits that a player can carry on throughout the rest of their life. If we give a meal plan, they're really restricted to what they can have. And ultimately, most of the time, from my experience, it leads to them not following those meals or snacks. So ultimately, we give out recipe cards and also little infographics that look like this that promote really good options for them to have for breakfast. We've created a number of different protein quantities for these infographics. We have 20, 30 and 40 gram ones, and we tailor them to the players that ultimately will require the different amounts of protein. Then we've got the lunch one and also the dinner ones. These ones are all really easy, quick, simple meals. People tend to overcomplicate nutrition quite a lot, but these infographics show that simple salmon, rice and broccoli is really quick and easy to put together as well. Same with the breakfast wraps. A lot of players forget breakfast in the morning if they don't have time. Some of these can be prepped in advance, night before, making sure that you can just grab it out of the fridge in the morning. These breakfast wraps also can be frozen, so you can meal prep them in advance, take them out of the freezer, stick them in the air fryer if you've got one, or stick them in the oven, and reheat whilst you brush your teeth or jumping in the shower, and eat them on the way to training as well. When it comes to snacks as well, giving the players lots of different options to choose from, so making sure that they're choosing a protein option, carb option, and fruit and veg. If they are a player that is struggling to gain weight, they've got a really high energy expenditure, we could look to consider supplementing with an extra what we call energy boost items, such as nuts, hummus, nut butters, or even cheese. And then when it comes to pre-bed snack options, given a couple of different options that will help players hit their protein goals, but also promoting really good sleep. So having some really high tryptophan products and also some high GI carbohydrates. On to my everyday tips. Making sure to eat every 3 to 4 hours. Now, I know Leigh said there is some evidence out there that you can have 100 grams of protein and it maximally stimulates muscle protein synthesis. And to put that into a little bit of perspective, that's approximately 3 chicken breasts. If you're smashing 3 chicken breasts for lunch, I can promise you this, you're going to probably struggle to get the other fueling food groups in. So such as your carbohydrates, you're going to really struggle to get that in, as well as your fruit and veg. So whilst you're maximally stimulating muscle protein synthesis, you're probably not going to be optimally fueling your training. Kickstart your day with breakfast. So it's really important to kickstart that muscle protein synthesis as soon as we get up, to make sure that we're not spending too much time in muscle protein breakdown. So some of the easy, quick breakfast options, plan them into your day, meal prep them, freeze them in bulk, and just take them out when you need them. And as I said, aim for 20 to 40 grams of protein per meal and snack. Or if you want to be a little bit more specific, if you're looking to gain some muscle mass, the recommendations I give to my players are between 1.6 to 1.8 grams per kilo. And that just allows them to get enough protein in, but also you're not jeopardizing those other food groups. For those of you that have training, a couple of little tips for that. Aim to consume your last high protein meal approximately 2 to 3 hours before training. That just gives your body a little bit of time to digest it. Eat a large meal too close to training, it might just give you a little bit of indigestion, heartburn, might worst case scenario because you could vomit at the side of the pitch, especially since they're working on a full contact sport. If they're doing full contact next to the stomach full of food, not a good combination. So making sure that you're giving your body a little bit of time to digest the food there as well. Although Leigh said there's no anabolic window that you really need to consume within X amount of minutes from completing exercise. A lot of you youth players may be playing in the evening. If we wait a long period of time before we then consume our next recovery meal, you're then going to be potentially encroaching on your bedtime, maybe 10, 11 o'clock at night, which then that could jeopardize your sleep and also cause you to have to stay up a little bit longer. So the reason why I say consume protein within an hour of finishing training is just so we can kickstart that recovery process. and also to make sure that we're not jeopardising any sleep. For those of you that are training a little bit earlier on in the day, aim to kickstart your meals and snacks as soon as you possibly can after that training session, just to make sure that you're getting enough protein in throughout the day, but also you're not jeopardising your carbs and healthy fat intake as well. We'll quickly run through a day in life of, just to give you a little bit of an indication to how feasible it actually is. So breakfast, 3 medium eggs scrambled with peppers, mushrooms, two bagels and a glass of orange juice. Super quick, easy snack of Graham's protein yogurt, some pretzels, squares bar, apple and water. And to give a little bit of insight, this is an actual players that I work with. It's food diary. Your lunch, 2 wraps and rice with some chicken on it and some salad, 2 bar small packet of crisps, 2 easy peeler oranges and a bottle of water. Smoothie just to act as that pre-training fueling snack, but also to get that protein in through the milk and also the skewer yogurt. Pre-training snack, and then also post-training snack of tomato and basil pasta that they ate on the way home. And then once they got home, they had a long distance to travel. It was just ultimately off to bed for them. So you'll see that there's lots of different foods in there, keeping it nice and balanced, but also including some foods that the player actually enjoyed as well, just to keep food fun and keep that positive food relationship as well. So that's mainly what I do within the academy, just through one-to-ones as well. But within the performance environment, when I have players in camps, so that's everything from national team right down to our under 18s just now, it's not feasible for me to do one-to-ones with everybody. The reality of it is that one performance nutritionist to cover multiple squads of each about 40 players is really difficult. So although I do see the priority players that need to make changes quite quickly or have some serious fueling issues that we need to overcome to optimize their performance, they will get one-to-ones, but then the large majority of them, it's mainly just about how we can influence the environment to try and promote those optimal behaviours that we want them to have. So how do we implement nutrition into the day? So we sit down with what we call the MDT, so the multidisciplinary team. So that's everything from S&C coaches to physios to doctors to coaches. And we sit and plan the day, but also making sure that nutrition is in the schedule. The schedule then gets sent out to the players. So it also highlights how important nutrition is to the players because it's paired in with everything else, such as their gym sessions and their pitch sessions. So a little bit of some of the pictures that I've taken over my time at Scottish Rugby. And I think there's also one from my time at Hearts to try and positively influence the players into making those really good changes and really good performance behaviours that we want them to make. So the majority of our meals are all buffet style. So there will be 2 to 3 protein options to try and promote the players into taking options that they really like. If there's 3 options, there's bound to be 1 option that they will like. And then it also allows each player to cater for their own individual needs. Every player has their own individual development plan, so it allows them to tailor their own nutrition around breakfast, lunch and dinner to that. Most of our players will then go into a gym session, and then post-gym, they will get a protein shake, and that's just because it's convenient. You try and go from a gym session right into a pitch session, having eaten a big meal, it's just not that feasible, whereas we tend to find our players can consume the protein shake, and it's quite easy on the stomach as well. So these protein shakes are also tailored to the players. So is it big whey? Is it MRM shake, which is just protein powder with some additional carbohydrates in it, and it allows us to add some additional supplements into it, such as creatine and beta-alanine as well. We then sometimes, if there's gaps in the day, we'll put out products for the players, which tend to be Graham's protein yogurts. Great products, all completely natural, and they're all really high in protein as well. On some occasions where we can't have a buffet, such as if we're travelling, we use a fantastic caterer. If we're based in Edinburgh, called Fox & Co. And I work with the owner, Andy, to tailor each nutrition recipe for each of the main dishes to make sure it's hitting all the protein and carbohydrate requirements based on the day. And there's always 2 options to choose from as well to make sure the players get something that they actually like. This is one of our fridges from some of the snacks that we provide in the players' team room. So if they're staying overnight in a hotel, that they can have pre-bed snack, or an afternoon snack to make sure that they're keeping on top of their nutrition. So you'll see some high protein yogurts, some berries if they want to make smoothies. We'll always have supplements there as well, like the protein powders, so they can make smoothies and shakes. There's also some cold meats if they wish to make toasties or that type of thing. This is just an alternative type of protein shake that would be used on match day -1, so that's the day before the game, and it's just really high in omega-3s. So essentially it helps the players get in their omega-3s before the match day. This is the fridge that I helped stock and design with all the products that I wanted in it when I was a part of the Gildan Football Club, making sure that we've got an arrangement of different protein yogurts. We've got some chocolate milk there, which is one of the best recovery products out there that's completely natural, and then some smoothies and that type of thing. And you'll see some protein granola yogurts down there. These are our travel snacks that we put on for our players. This was the national team when they were going away to Italy or Ireland this year. We give 2 protein sources. So there's our up north biltong, fantastic product. All our players love it. We cannot restock it quick enough in the player team room. We've also got grenade bars and just your carbohydrate snacks and some chewing gum. And then that's just a picture of some of the supplements that we lay out in hotels to try and promote recovery around our players before they head into the games. So food products are key to our strategies. So under 18s, we promote a food first approach. So they don't actually receive any supplements. So we try and promote that they get everything through food. I think somebody is on mute. So chocolate milk is a fantastic product that contains everything that the body needs to optimally refuel. It's got carbohydrates in it, repair, it's got protein in it, and rehydrate as well. So it's a liquid, so it's really good for rehydration after training or games. There's our Graham's protein yogurts, and then also the biltong. So this is a Scottish-owned business, family that live up in Perthshire, Stirlingshire, and the products are the best biltong that we've probably tasted in Scotland. Our South African players love it. They say it's the next best thing that's closest to home. And for those of you that would like a discount code to it, they're trying to promote the business out there for other athletes to get hold of this really good product. So the discount code, I believe, will be sent out with the after webinar email. But if you want to write it down just now, protein HI20, and I'll get you 20% off. But when it comes to protein, more necessarily isn't better. It increases your satiety, which is why we ramp it up with players that are looking to decrease some fat mass. It also increases your energy expenditure. Muscle mass is really energy expensive to build. So if you're increasing your energy expenditure even more, you're just jeopardizing your chances of putting on as much muscle mass as you possibly can. And that's just through the thermic effect of food. Roughly about 27.5% to 30% of the energy that is in the protein is taken to digest it. So you don't want to go ballistic with it. It also jeopardizes the intake of fruit and veg and carbohydrates and healthy fats just through increasing your satiety. I did have one player that was smashing about 350 grams of protein per day. He was approximately about 80 kilos. So if you do the math on that, he was consuming double the amount of the upper end that Leigh was talking about, like that 2.2. He was struggling to put on weight. We dropped his protein. We reshuffled his meals and snacks to make sure that he's getting in all the other food groups. And now he's putting on muscle mass slowly steady, and he's feeling much happier as well, not feeling sick and full all the time. But then if you do a quick check on TikTok or even Instagram, you see some influencers that are promoting massive amounts of protein. So nobody would need to get 500 grams of protein in a day. That's a little bit ridiculous, unless you're 250 kilos body weight. And again, 300 grams of protein. Some of our bigger forwards will be recommended about 300 grams of protein, but your average athlete is probably about 70 to 80 kilos. You're not going to need to consume 300 grams of protein, nor even close to 500. But then also the food market has gone a little bit protein mad. There's protein that's added into absolutely everything. I mean, high protein coffee, even milk that's had protein, more protein added into it. And then the icing on the cake was the other day when I saw high protein chocolate. Put it into perspective, you need to consume the entire bar, which is about 500 calories to get 27 grams of protein. There is a lot better options out there than trying to get your protein intake in through chocolate. And to be honest, if you're wanting chocolate, just opt for some of your favorite chocolate that you would want in moderation. And I tell you what, it's going to satisfy those cravings a lot better than trying to opt for your 27 gram protein, high protein chocolate. But to just give you a little bit of an indication, whole food versus sport food / supplements. 1 pint of milk contains 20 grams of protein and has approximately 90 pence. Your YouFit 25 gram protein shake is £2. So in the cost of living just now, definitely I'd be opting for your milk. It's also really good at hydration. The deal will vouch for that. So really, really good product for athletes and also young people to be consuming. You then also got your skier, which if you're going to consume half a tub, which will allow you to hit roughly that 20 to 30 gram protein goal, versus your high protein pudding, which is 20 grams of protein and is almost 3 times the price. And then got a homemade chicken wrap if you manage to prep and prepare all your meals in advance, versus your grenade bar. Again, a lot more expensive than that, almost double the price. So you'll also get a lot more nutrients through this. And also there's quite a lot of artificial sweeteners in this, which sometimes can just upset people's tummies as well. So definitely would opt for the chicken wrap instead. Then just in terms of your chicken, rice and broccoli, I costed it at roughly about £1.40 per portion versus your Big Way shake. Now, although your Big Way shake is cheaper, you're going to get a lot more nutrients in your chicken and rice. So don't underestimate the whole foods on this one. But then that leads us nicely into supplements. So there's a lot of supplements out there. There's more and more supplements coming onto the market every single day. But not all supplements are batch tested. And what I mean by batch tested is it's sent to an independent laboratory and they test for any banned substances. And if you're wanting to pursue a career as an athlete, or you're in a performance development program, or you're signed to a football club, it's really important that if you are consuming supplements that you make sure they are batch tested. And that just gives you a little bit more assurance that it doesn't contain any banned substances. It should also be noted that any player, regardless of their age, can be drug tested. So it's really important that you guys are aware of that. Supplements are not regulated the same way food is. So a random person could create a protein powder essentially, and they don't have to declare everything that's on the label because it's not regulated. So they could add some banned substance in it to make it a little bit more effective. But then also that is not good for your health and it could flag up in an anti-doping test. Some supplements have little or no evidence because there's so many coming up onto the market. They make all these bizarre claims that they're going to help so many different things or cause you to gain a lot more muscle mass, but a lot of them don't have very little evidence. And because supplements are not regulated, the ingredient list may not be accurate. They may be laced or contaminated with banned substances as well. So to put it into a little bit of perspective, 1 in 4 supplements contain a prohibited substance or a banned substance. So it's really important that if you are, even from a health point of view, wanting to take any supplements, that you make sure they're batch tested. Doesn't guarantee you 100% safety, but it just gives you that little bit more safety or assurance that it's a little bit more safe. Not just doping risk, but a safety concern. This was a product that was released onto the market last summer, I believe. It was just a new batch. And the product had no mention of caffeine on it at all. It wasn't in the ingredient list. And it was promoting people to take 2 dosages of it a day, which would amount to 48 cups of coffee, which is potentially enough to kill somebody. So really important you opt for a brand that's batch tested, but also a well-known brand as well. On to the last topic, really important that we don't forget about the other food groups. So low protein is really important, as I mentioned, with my 350 gram of protein a day athlete. It's really important that we remember carbohydrates, fats, and fruit and vegetables as well to make sure that we're healthy, happy, and also making sure that we are chasing those goals, whatever they may be, whether it may be increases in lean mass or even just having a better performance or recovery. So ensure you consume a balanced diet. This is some of the information that we give out in camps. We stick them up all around restaurants just to make sure our athletes are consuming enough carbohydrates for hitting their protein goals and also getting in those demon foods, as some of the players call them, fruit and veg. And then if we do have players that need that little bit of an extra energy boost just to try and make sure they're matching their energy intake to their energy expenditure, they can add some additional food items. Just a little bit of a summary. So plan your nutrition day to day to make sure you're optimizing your nutrition around your training. Aiming for 20 to 40 grams of protein per meal or snack, or if you want to be a little bit more specific, aiming for that 1.6 to 1.8 grams per kilogram per day. And that will just help promote those increases in lean mass and also allow you to get in enough carbohydrates and fruit and veg and healthy fats. Making sure that we're consuming at least 3 main meals and 2 to 3 snacks a day that all contain protein. For additional carb snacks that you may wish to use around training are additional to that. Remember, more isn't necessarily better. And remember, the food market is exploded with protein, but don't underestimate the whole food options as well. Supplements can be convenient. We definitely use them in the performance environment when players need a refuel or they need their protein recovery products when we don't have a lot of time in between sessions. So they definitely are useful. I wouldn't say you need to rely on them. We do have some athletes, or I have worked with some athletes in the past as well, that just don't take supplements and they are still very successful athletes. And remember, protein is important, but remember all your other food groups too.